Work starts Monday. Just sign. That was the first sentence she ever said to me. No greeting, no explanation, no attempt to pretend this was a conversation between two human beings. She stood on my porch like she owned the morning itself, clipboard balanced on her forearm, pen tapping in a slow, impatient rhythm. Her smile was thin, stretched tight enough to look rehearsed. The kind of smile people practice in mirrors before they walk into meetings they've already decided they're going to win. I didn't take the pen. For a second, she just held it there between us, suspended in the quiet Texas heat, like the outcome was obvious and I was simply behind schedule. When I still didn't move, she set the clipboard on my porch railing, turned without another word, and walked back to her white luxury SUV. Engine started. Gravel popped beneath her tires. Conversation over, at least in her mind. 3 months later, a $200,000 swimming pool sat squarely on the southeast corner of my land. And 2 weeks after that, they sent me the bill. Now, before you decide what kind of story this is, you should know a few things about me. My name is Garrett Wolfe. I'm 58 years old, and most of my life has been measured in engine hours instead of calendar pages. I've spent 4 decades as a diesel mechanic, the kind of work where you don't fix problems by shouting at them, you fix them by listening closely until you understand exactly what's broken. My right hand doesn't straighten all the way anymore. Years of wrench torque and cold mornings did that. My hearing isn't perfect either, but my memory, that's still sharp where it matters. Especially when it comes to land. I owned 34 acres just outside a subdivision called Calder Ridge Kines. Own isn't a technicality or a hopeful claim. It's documented, stamped, recorded, and backed by 70 years of uninterrupted history. My grandfather cleared that property in the early 1950s with nothing but stubbornness and tools he sharpened himself. Back then, it wasn't a scenic rural parcel. It was cedar thickets and limestone slabs, brush so thick you had to fight your way through it step by step. He carved fence posts out of trees he felled with his own hands. He set iron survey markers into the earth and filed a deed so meticulously described that even modern survey software still references it. My father ran cattle there until his heart gave out in 2009. When the land passed to me, it came clean. No loans, no shared access agreements, no hidden clauses buried in developer paperwork. Just soil, history, and responsibility. For 11 quiet years, the arrangement worked perfectly. The subdivision expanded around my property like water flowing around a rock. New homes appeared, asphalt roads replaced dirt trails, mailboxes lined up in neat suburban rows. The HOA managed landscaping standards, architectural guidelines, and the usual politics that come with people living close enough to argue about fence colors. None of it concerned me. I wasn't part of their organization. I never bought one of their lots. I never signed their membership contracts. Legally speaking, my ranch was an island, private ground surrounded by deed-restricted suburbia. Most folks respected that, until Dorena Yates became HOA president. Dorena had spent years working as a real estate assistant before discovering she had a particular talent for authority. She treated the HOA not like a volunteer board, but like a miniature government, complete with enforcement campaigns, policy initiatives, and a steady stream of certified letters sent to anyone who questioned her. Her vehicle of choice was a pristine white SUV with a magnetic placard announcing her title in bold blue lettering. She wanted people to know who was in charge. The first time she came onto my property unannounced, she claimed a survey had revealed something interesting. According to her documents, the low corner of my southeastern boundary wasn't actually mine at all. It was, she said, a drainage corridor belonging to the community. She had paperwork. It had stamps. It looked official in the way anything looks official when someone is determined enough to make it so. I glanced at it briefly and handed it back. Then I suggested she verify the county records before driving out with assumptions that could turn expensive. She wrote something down, smiled like she had just cataloged a minor inconvenience, and left. I remember standing there afterward, dust drifting slowly back to the ground, feeling the same tight awareness I get when a rebuilt engine makes a noise it shouldn't. Not panic, not anger, just attention. 3 weeks later, excavators arrived. They rolled in at sunrise like invited guests, heavy diesel machines idling on soil my family had held for generations. Their foreman was polite enough, a sunburned contractor named Bryce who believed completely in the legality of his assignment. He showed approved plans, county permits, survey maps. Everything appeared in order until you actually compared the paperwork to reality. That afternoon, I called my cousin Harold, who spent most of his career examining land titles for a county office. He has the rare ability to reconstruct ownership history faster than most people can order lunch. 20 minutes after I gave him the parcel details, he called back. "Garage," he said quietly, "they're building on your property, no question about it." A simple clerical mistake swapped 2 digits in the permit application. On paper, that typo shifted the approved construction zone just far enough to place it entirely on my land. In legal terms, the permit meant nothing. In practical terms, they were already digging. A lot of people would have stormed back to that fence line yelling. I didn't. Because experience teaches you something important. Once you start tearing things apart emotionally, evidence has a way of disappearing physically. So, I began documenting everything. Camera footage, boundary markers, vehicle plates, daily progress reports spoken into my phone in a voice so calm it almost bored me. Then, I opened the old fireproof lockbox in my barn and took out the original deed. The paper smelled of oil and dust and memory. My grandfather's initials were still penciled beside the exact corner where steel tracks were now carving trenches into the earth. That's when I realized this wasn't just a misunderstanding, this was the beginning of a very deliberate fight. And the woman who had left that clipboard on my porch had no idea how patient I could be. Because while she believed she was starting construction, I was already starting something else, something slower, something quieter. Something that would eventually bring her entire plan crashing down. And what she did next would prove she wasn't just mistaken, she was committed. I didn't go back to the fence line that morning. That's the part most people get wrong when they hear a story like this. They imagine rage. They imagine a man storming across the pasture, shouting over engine noise, threatening lawsuits before breakfast. Maybe 20 years earlier I would have given them a version of that. Age changes the way you spend your energy. So does grief. So does work that teaches you the value of diagnosis before repair. Instead, I went inside, rinsed the dust from my hands, and laid the permit copy flat on my kitchen table. The house was quiet except for the old refrigerator humming in the corner and the ticking wall clock above the pantry. Morning light came through the sink window and landed right across the county seal on the page Bryce had shown me. It looked official, legitimate, clean. That was the first thing that bothered me. Real fraud rarely looks sloppy at the surface. Sloppy gets caught too early. The dangerous kind looks organized. Numbered pages, signatures in blue ink, plenty of stamps and routing notations. The goal is not to convince a judge right away. The goal is to move fast enough that by the time anyone questions it, concrete has already been poured. I read the permit line by line. Parcel reference, drainage improvement classification, community amenity enhancement, contractor authorization, inspection schedule. It all fit together just well enough to make a working man trust that someone else had done the checking. But there was one string of numbers that sat wrong in my head. I'd seen my parcel ID too many times over the years for it not to. Land teaches you numbers the same way engines teach you sounds. You might not quote the manual word for word, but you know when something is off by feel alone. I pulled the folder from the hall cabinet where I keep tax statements, warranty records, and every piece of paper too important to leave to memory. 20 minutes later, I had 3 surveys spread across the table, 1 tax appraisal notice, 2 deeds, and a yellow legal pad covered in handwriting. That's when I found it. 2 digits switched in the parcel description. Just 2. To someone who has never dealt with land records, that probably sounds laughably small, a typo, a harmless clerical mix-up. But property law is full of tiny hinges that swing giant doors. 2 digits in the wrong place can move a line, change a corner, shift a right-of-way, or turn somebody else's field into your approved project area. I sat back in my chair and looked out the window toward the south pasture. The excavators were still there, bright yellow against the scrub and limestone. From a distance they looked slow and almost harmless, but every minute they stayed where they were, the situation got harder to untangle. Dirt moved, markers disappeared, assumptions hardened into routine. And once routine settles in, people start saying dangerous things. Things like, well, it's already built. Things like, surely we can work something out. Things like, no point fighting over something that benefits everybody. That kind of language has buried more theft than crowbars ever did. So I made 3 calls. The first was to a survey archivist I'd known for years, a woman named Elise Mercer, who had once helped me settle a boundary issue with a pipeline company. Elise had a habit of answering the phone like she was already annoyed with you, which I appreciated because it saved time. "Tell me exactly what's wrong," she said. I did. Then I texted her photos of the permit and the older survey copies. 10 minutes later, she called back. They didn't just make a typo, they built their whole application around it. I asked what she meant. She explained it in the flat clinical tone of someone pointing at a cracked foundation. The parcel error wasn't isolated. Their drainage justification, setback calculations, and access corridor all depended on the wrong tract being treated as common use land. Fix the number, and the logic collapsed. It wasn't a minor paperwork defect, it was structural. Can it be challenged? It can be buried, or it can be challenged, depends how fast you move. The second call I made was to the county permitting office. After enough transfers, I reached a man named Leon who sounded exhausted before I finished my first sentence. I gave him the permit number and asked him to verify the parcel listed on the filing. Keyboard clicks, silence, more clicks, then a pause. Well, that appears to be the parcel associated with the permit, yes. It's not the parcel where the machines are sitting. Another pause, longer this time. Are you saying active construction is occurring outside the described tract? I'm saying active construction is occurring on my land. His voice changed after that. Not dramatic, just tighter around the edges. He asked for email copies of my documents. He told me not to interfere physically with the crew. He said an internal review would have to be opened. Internal review. Useful words sometimes. Also words people use when they want a problem to sit quietly in a stack until momentum solves it for them. So I made the third call to an attorney. Not the friend of a friend kind, not someone who handles some real estate stuff. I called a litigation lawyer with a reputation for being expensive, precise, and impossible to bluff. Her name was Naomi Vale. She met me the next afternoon in an office above an insurance brokerage on the courthouse square. No flashy decor, no dramatic walls of victories, just shelves of binders, a metal desk, and a woman in a gray jacket reading my documents as if she could smell dishonesty through paper. When she finished, she looked up and asked the most important question anyone had asked so far. Do you want compensation, delay, or control? I told her I wanted my land back. That got the first hint of approval from her all day. Good, she said. Control is cleaner. She explained the landscape without wasting words. Best case, the county freezes work, the board retreats, and everything turns into a frantic negotiation. More likely, the HOA tries to bluff through it. They'd claim community necessity, drainage dependency, good faith reliance, maybe even historical use. They'd count on cost, fatigue, and public pressure wearing me down. Will they win? No, she said, but they may behave like people who think the appearance of confidence is the same thing as it. That turned out to be exactly right. By the end of the week, the digging continued. Then forms went up at the subdivision entrance advertising a future recreation amenity. Residents began posting excited comments online. Families talked about summer access. The board announced property values would rise. Somewhere inside all that cheerful language was a fact nobody seemed eager to say out loud. They were celebrating a project they had no right to build. Naomi sent a formal demand letter. Hard stop, preserve documents, cease construction, produce survey authority, confirm chain of title. The kind of letter that gives decent people a reason to correct their mistake. The board responded through counsel with 3 pages of polished deflection and 1 sentence that told me exactly who I was dealing with. Our clients deny any actionable encroachment. Actionable encroachment. That's how they described heavy equipment sitting beyond my fence line. I laughed when I read it, not because it was funny, but because sometimes language gets so ridiculous it stops being threatening and starts being useful. Words like that aren't written for truth, they're written for positioning. And once someone starts positioning that early, it means they already know where the weak spot is. So I drove out at sunset with my phone, a notebook, and a folding chair. I sat on the ridge over the southeast corner and watched. Crew trucks came and went. A compact loader moved fill. Stakes had been reset farther inward than they'd been 2 days earlier. Somebody was adjusting the visual story on the ground. Not enough to fix it, just enough to blur it later. I filmed everything. At one point, Bryce saw me and walked over. He looked uneasy now, less certain than before. "Mr. Turner, I'm just trying to keep my guys working." "I know. If there's a dispute, I wasn't told the details." "I know that too." He hesitated, and then asked the question that told me conscience had finally caught up with paperwork. "Am I standing on your property right now?" I looked past him at the stakes, the disturbed earth, the line of cedar posts my father and I replaced after the flood of '97. "Yes," I said, "you are." He nodded once. No argument, no performance, just a man realizing he'd been handed bad information from people up the chain. He went back to his truck, made a call, and left 30 minutes later with his crew. The machines stayed. But the next move came faster than I expected, because the following Monday before sunrise, somebody came onto that corner with fresh markers and a transit tripod. And when I got there, one of my original boundary pins was gone. That was the moment the whole... By the time I got down to the southeast corner, the sun was still low enough to throw long shadows across the dirt. That mattered. Early light shows disturbance better than noon ever will. Fresh cuts in the soil hold a different color. Boot tracks stay crisp. Drag marks stand out. A place that's been touched before breakfast always looks slightly wrong, even when whoever touched it thought they cleaned up after themselves. And my land looked wrong. The transit tripod stood near the disturbed line like some kind of polite apology for what had already happened. 2 new marker flags fluttered in the breeze. One orange, one yellow. Neither belonged there. I walked straight to the corner where the original pin had been since before I was born. Empty. Not loose, not bent, not half exposed after shear vibration. Gone. I crouched and put my fingertips into the hole it had left behind. The dirt was still soft around the edges. Whoever pulled it had done it recently and not carefully. A little crescent of broken caliche had chipped off to one side. There was a heel print behind it, sharp enough to hold tread pattern. Beside that, a shallow groove where metal had been levered against stone. People think anger arrives all at once. That's not how it works for me. What I felt in that moment was colder than anger, cleaner too, because now I knew. Before, there had still been room for the lie people tell themselves when they're trying to avoid consequences. Miscommunication, bad paperwork, an overconfident board, a contractor trusting the wrong file. But when somebody crosses onto your property and removes a survey marker that predates half the houses around it, the story changes. That's not confusion, that's intention. I took photos first. Wide shots, close shots, video with narration, the missing pin location, the fresh flags, the disturbed earth, the tripod, the tracks leading back toward the access road. Then I stepped back and photographed the whole line from 3 different angles so nobody could later claim I was isolating details out of context. Boring evidence wins. Exciting evidence gets questioned. I called Naomi from the field. She answered on the second ring. "Tell me." "One of the original pins is gone." Silence for half a second. Then, "Do not touch anything." "I wasn't planning to." "Good. Send me everything, every angle, and call the sheriff's office, not county permitting. This just moved." That was Naomi's gift. She knew when a problem changed categories. I sent the images, then called the non-emergency line. A deputy arrived 40 minutes later, a broad-shouldered man named Luis Ortega, with sunburned cheeks and the expression of someone who had expected a property complaint and found something more serious. He didn't rush. He looked at the hole, the tripod, the fresh flags, my deed copies, the older survey maps. Then he asked the only question that mattered. How long had that pin been there? "At least since the early 60s, probably earlier." "You have records for it?" "Several." He nodded slowly and began taking his own photographs. I liked him immediately for that. Too many people want to talk first and verify second. Ortega worked the right way around. He also found something I had missed, About 15 yards back in the brush near the temporary construction path, there was a scuffed patch where somebody had tossed debris in a hurry. Broken survey ribbon, 2 crushed water bottles, a bent metal tag, and half buried under loose rock, a rust-darkened iron pin with old mineral staining still caked at one end. Ortega didn't say much when he picked it up. He just looked at me once, then sealed it into an evidence bag. The quiet after that felt different, final. By noon, Naomi had filed an emergency motion seeking preservation of evidence and immediate injunctive relief. By 3, the contractor had been formally notified to suspend activity pending review. And by evening, somebody on the HOA side had realized the situation was turning dangerous, because that's when the message campaign began. It started subtly. A homeowner I vaguely knew from the gas station sent me a note saying he heard I was trying to kill the pool project over a line dispute. Then another message came through from someone else asking if I'd really refused a compromise easement that would help local families. By dinner, the neighborhood Facebook group, which I'd never joined, never read, and never cared about, had apparently become a full courtroom of self-appointed experts. I know this because my neighbor June printed screenshots and drove them over in a manila envelope like she was delivering pathology slides. June lives on the county road west of me. Widow, retired school librarian, sees everything, says only what she can support. She set the envelope on my kitchen table and said, "You should know what's being said before it hardens." Inside were 12 screenshots. The narrative had arrived fully formed. I was stubborn. I was anti-community. I had known about the project all along. The disputed corner was basically useless pasture anyway. Children were being deprived of a safe summer space because one old rancher wanted to feel important. No mention of the missing pin, no mention of the incorrect parcel, no mention of the fact that the useless pasture belonged to someone. That's the thing about public pressure. It rarely argues the real facts. It argues around them until people forget where the center was. June poured herself coffee and sat down across from me. "You going to answer any of this?" "No." She nodded, like that was the correct answer to a question she'd mostly asked for ceremony. "Good," she said. "People who campaign that hard before court usually know court won't go their way." The next morning, Naomi called me into her office. She had a lad pad full of notes, a stack of printed emails, and the particular stillness she gets when her mind is moving faster than her voice. The contractor's lawyer is trying to distance themselves from the boundary alteration, which means one of 2 things. Either the board acted through the surveyor directly, or someone is about to become very cooperative. I asked whether the removed pin changed the case materially. "It changes the temperature," she said. "Judges understand disputed surveys. They understand bad applications. But marker tampering? That suggests consciousness. People do that when they know the real line hurts them." She slid a document across the desk. It was a demand for production tied to the emergency filing. Meeting notes, survey correspondence, draft plats, text messages, internal emails, contractor instructions, any communication related to the southeast corner, drainage alignment, or boundary staking. "Will they hand it over?" I asked. "No," she said, "but they'll hand over enough, and enough is all I need." She was right again. 3 days later, the first batch came in, incomplete, late, and heavily curated, the legal equivalent of somebody tidying a room while the fire is still burning in the garage. But even curated records tell stories. The board minutes from 2 months earlier described the pool vote as unanimously approved, subject to minor field adjustments. That phrase bothered Naomi immediately. Minor field adjustments is one of those deliberately soft expressions professionals use when they want a record to sound ordinary while leaving themselves room to do something ugly. Then there were the emails. Most were harmless logistics: fencing timing, subcontractors, lighting packages, estimated completion windows. And then there was one thread between the board president, a consulting surveyor, and a developer representative. Short messages, no dramatic confessions. People almost never write movie dialogue when committing real misconduct. What they write is worse because it's normal. One line read, "If the original markers create delay, can the corner be reset to match the drainage plan?" Another replied, "Field resolution is possible if everyone stays aligned." And then, "Need this done before county recheck." Naomi read those 3 lines twice and circled them without speaking. That afternoon, she put in a call to a former board member whose name had appeared once in the earlier minutes and then vanished completely after the approval vote. Her name was Lydia Fenn. Lydia agreed to meet, not at Naomi's office, not at my ranch, at a diner off the highway where truckers stop for pie and no one asks questions unless they're refilling your coffee. She was in her early 60s, dressed plainly, hair pinned back, a woman with the posture of someone who had spent years sitting upright through meetings she did not respect. She brought a folder. That was promising. People who bring folders usually bring truth, or at least the version of it they're finally tired of carrying. The surveyor did not call me directly. Men in his position almost never do. They call through lawyers, or they send a message through someone who knows how to phrase fear in professional language. In this case, it came through Naomi at 7:12 on a Thursday night while I was in the barn checking a pressure regulator on the north trough line. She didn't bother with a greeting. He wants protection before he talks. I tightened the regulator another quarter turn and held the phone between shoulder and ear. Protection from what? From being the only one left holding the bag. That told me everything I needed to know. People stay loyal to bad plans right up until they understand two things at once. First, that the plan is actually collapsing, and second, that the people who convinced them to go along with it are already preparing to step aside and let gravity do the rest. The surveyor's name was Travis Boren, mid-40s, licensed almost 20 years. Good reputation once, from what Naomi had gathered. No disciplinary history. Mortgage. 2 kids. Enough obligations to make the wrong decision feel survivable in the short term and catastrophic in the long term. He agreed to meet at Naomi's office the following morning with his own counsel present. When I got there, Travis was already seated at the conference table, turning a foam coffee cup slowly between both hands. He had the look of a man who hadn't slept and knew more sleepless nights were coming. His attorney sat beside him in a navy suit with the kind of expression defense lawyers wear when they've already advised the truth and now are managing the cost of it. Naomi didn't open with threats. That would have been a waste. She laid out the facts the way a mechanic lays out damaged parts on clean paper. The incorrect parcel description, the emergency filings, the recovered original PIN, the internal emails, Lydia Fenn's documents, and the pending court date. Then she let the silence do what silence does when someone is waiting to hear whether there is still a safe lie left to tell. There wasn't. Travis swallowed and said, "I didn't invent the line." Nobody answered immediately. Then Naomi said, "Who did?" He looked at his lawyer first, then at the table. The line I was instructed to certify was based on a drainage use interpretation I was told had already been approved at the board level. "Told by whom?" Naomi asked. He hesitated. "Marissa Dane." There it was. Not rumor, not implication, a name attached to instruction. Travis kept talking once he started, which often happens when people have been carrying a version of the truth alone too long. He said the original topography didn't support the amenity layout the board wanted. If the pool stayed within actual common area limits, the footprint got tighter, the access path became awkward, and the landscaping package lost the visual symmetry Marissa had promised residents in the presentation renderings. So alternatives were discussed. At first, according to him, it was framed as an interpretation question: drainage corridor, historical runoff, flexible edge use, the sort of language that invites a professional to keep one foot in ambiguity while someone else builds a bridge across it. Then the pressure sharpened. Emails, calls, one in-person site visit. Marissa insisted the southeast corner had always been treated as transitional ground and said the owner, me, though she never used my name in the first telling, was unlikely to litigate if the final product looked permanent enough. That phrase hit me harder than I expected, not because it was cruel, because it was casual, permanent enough, like people stop defending what's theirs once concrete cures. Naomi asked the next question without changing expression. "Did you remove the original marker?" "No." "Did you tell anyone else to?" "No." "Did you know it had been removed?" A longer pause. "Yes." "When?" "The morning after." Naomi slid a yellow pad toward him. "Then write down exactly how you learned." He did. not elegantly, not in the polished cadence of legal strategy, just the blunt, strained handwriting of a man trying to salvage whatever portion of his life could still be separated from the worst choice he'd made in it. He wrote that a contractor superintendent called him before dawn saying the corner had been cleaned up for alignment. He wrote that when he arrived, the pin was gone, and new temporary stakes had already been set closer to the drainage swale. He wrote that he understood immediately what had happened, and he wrote that instead of reporting it, he incorporated the revised position into a field sketch later used to support continuing work. His lawyer asked for the statement to be treated as part of cooperation discussions. Naomi agreed, with conditions. Not immunity, she couldn't offer that, but if Travis turned over everything, emails, drafts, texts, call logs, file revisions, backup copies, all of it, she would notify the district attorney that he had come in before being subpoenaed to the point of total ruin. That mattered to him more than I think he expected it to. You could see it in the way his shoulders dropped. Not relief exactly, more like the first honest measurement of damage after a long stretch of denial. Before the meeting ended, Naomi asked one more question. Was this just about getting the pool built where she wanted it? Travis stared at the coffee cup in his hands for several seconds. No, he said finally. Then he reached into his briefcase and produced a flash drive. I have learned over the years that truly bad news almost never arrives in dramatic packaging. It comes in ordinary forms: a voicemail, a folded invoice, a mislabeled envelope. In this case, a black plastic flash drive with a red stripe on one side. On it were draft presentation files, budget revisions, internal planning notes, and a folder called Post-Completion Options. Naomi opened that one first. Inside was a slide deck prepared for Marissa and a developer representative named Nolan Pierce. Nolan was the original subdivision developer, not the public face anymore, but still close enough to the machinery to keep earning from it. The deck was blunt in the way private greed often is when it believes it has privacy. The pool was not just an amenity, it was phase one. If completed and absorbed into a separate operating entity later, the facility could be repackaged as a paid-use recreation asset. Event rentals, seasonal memberships, private swim instruction contracts, small upscale gatherings marketed to residents and non-residents alike. The deck projected revenue within 3 years. And sitting inside the ownership flow chart was a newly formed holding company. Registered manager? Marissa Dane. I read that slide twice, then a third time, because it answered a question I hadn't quite been able to articulate before. Why risk so much for one corner of pasture? Why push this hard? Why gamble permits, board authority, neighborhood trust, and legal exposure on a project that could have been redesigned if community recreation were truly the goal? The answer was simple, because the pool wasn't the end of the plan, it was the asset. My land just happened to be where they wanted to park it. Naomi printed the organizational chart and set it aside without comment. She had gone very still, which for her was the equivalent of a thunderstorm siren. Travis, maybe sensing there was no point protecting anything now, kept talking. Marissa assured him the board minutes would be handled. She said the homeowners would support anything once the ribbon cutting happened and children were using the facility. She said litigation risk was low because people like him, and again she meant me, hate attention and settle privately if pressured early. She also said something else that made Naomi actually look up from her notes. What? Naomi asked. Travis rubbed a hand across his forehead. She said if documents became a problem, Nolan knew how to clean paper. The room went quiet. People throw around phrases like that when they want to sound more powerful than they are, but even performative corruption leaves fingerprints, and once a phrase like clean paper enters the record, every missing file, every amended minute, every mysteriously delayed production request starts to look less like incompetence and more like method. By late afternoon, Naomi had already sent preservation notices to 3 additional parties, including Nolan Pierce and the HOA's management company. She also prepared a criminal referral packet thicker than anything I had seen on the case so far. I asked whether this changed our civil posture. She said, "It widens it. You came in with a boundary case. You now have evidence supporting fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, spoliation concerns, and self-dealing. Can they still settle?" She looked at me over her glasses. He arrived just before sunset. Not in a pickup, not in a county sedan, not in anything that belonged on a caliche road after rain. He came in a dark rental SUV that looked freshly washed and entirely unsuited for the half-mile stretch of dust leading to my date. Even before he stepped out, I knew he wasn't local. Locals close gates behind them without thinking. This man stood there for a moment, studying the latch like it might require a permit. He was in his 50s, pressed blue suit, loafers that had never met a cattle guard, silver watch, careful haircut. The kind of man whose job is not to solve a crisis, but to make a crisis sound manageable to the person it's happening to. He introduced himself as Russell Hale. No card from the HOA, no company logo, no real explanation, just a measured smile and a sentence that told me exactly why he was there. I've been asked to discuss a resolution that could spare everyone a great deal of ugliness. People who bring honest resolutions don't start with ugliness. They start with facts, terms, accountability. This was not that. I didn't invite him inside. We sat on the porch because I wanted him slightly uncomfortable and fully visible. He placed a leather folder on the table between us and folded his hands like a man prepared to present an insurance product. "The board is prepared," he said, "to recognize your interests in the disputed area." Recognize. Not restore, not admit. Recognize. I said nothing. He took that as permission to continue. The proposal was laid out in polished language over 7 pages. The HOA would deed back formal control of the southeast corner. They would dismiss the counterclaim. They would make a good faith payment of $35,000. In return, I would release all civil claims against the association, its officers, contractors, consultants, and affiliated entities. I would decline further cooperation in any criminal or regulatory investigation to the fullest extent legally permitted. And I would agree not to publicize, characterize, or discuss the dispute in a way that could unfairly damage reputations. There it was. Not a settlement, a cleanup plan. I read the pages once all the way through, then a second time more slowly. The key term wasn't the money, it wasn't even the release. It was silence. Silence wrapped in legal phrasing, padded with courtesies, presented like a favor. Russell watched my face carefully while I read. He was trying to gauge whether I was a practical man or a sentimental one, whether I'd look at the number and imagine relief, whether I'd look at the future and decide peace was worth more than principle. He had the wrong field manual. When I set the packet down, he leaned forward slightly. "This is a serious offer, Mr. Turner." "I'm sure it is. There's risk in letting this continue." "For who?" He smiled, but only with one side of his mouth. "Litigation spreads, costs multiply. The public record rarely tells a neat story. You might find vindication, even if achieved, comes with collateral damage." That was the first honest thing he had said, because collateral damage was exactly what Marissa feared now. Not my damage, hers. I looked out toward the southeast pasture where the unfinished pool shell sat beyond the cedar line like a half-buried mistake. "Tell them no," I said. He blinked once. "You haven't countered. There isn't one. The number is negotiable. It isn't about the number." That seemed to irritate him more than I expected. Men like Russell prefer disputes that can be converted cleanly into math. Principle makes them work harder. He sat back and changed tactics. "With respect, Mr. Turner, organizations sometimes survive situations that individuals do not. If this turns fully adversarial, the association will defend itself with all available resources." I almost laughed. That line had probably worked on half the people he'd used it on, but by then I knew more about their internal panic than he did. Resignations, altered minutes, a surveyor cooperating, homeowners asking where dues had gone. The organization he was invoking like a storm front was already leaking from every seam. So I gave him the only answer I wanted on the record from the start. "They built on my land, they moved a pin, they falsified minutes, and now they want me quiet. No." This time the smile disappeared completely. He closed the folder, stood, and brushed a speck of dust from his trouser leg. "Then I hope your counsel has prepared you for what happens next." "She has." He nodded once, turned, and walked back to the SUV. Only after he left did I touch the folder again. Inside the back pocket was one more page he hadn't mentioned verbally. A draft mutual statement for future release. It described the whole affair as a good-faith misunderstanding arising from historical boundary ambiguities and communication breakdowns. That line made me angrier than the money. Not because it lied lazily. There was nothing ambiguous about a removed marker and edited minutes. There was nothing good faith about a holding company waiting behind the build-out. The statement wasn't meant to persuade me, it was meant to give everyone else language later. Insurance language, press language, neighbor language. The language of people who want a scandal to die without ever naming the body. I sent the entire packet to Naomi. She called back 20 minutes later. "They're desperate." That was my read. "No," she said, "worse than desperate, sloppy. The release is overbroad, the criminal cooperation language is absurd, and the affiliated entities definition is drafted wide enough to cover parties they haven't disclosed publicly." That got my attention. Meaning? Meaning there may be additional shell entities or side agreements. The next day she subpoenaed records tied to every entity named or implied in the release. Management companies, development affiliates, holding structures, vendor pass-throughs. It was less dramatic than people imagine these things to be. No gavel, no revelation music, just forms, service, deadlines, and a lawyer with the patience to widen a funnel until the truth has nowhere left to pool except center. The first response came from the HOA's insurer. That alone told its own story. Someone had finally notified the carrier, which meant the association had crossed from political problem into covered risk territory. Insurers do not like surprises, and they like board misconduct dressed up as landscaping even less. Within days, a reservation of rights letter surfaced. The carrier was investigating whether coverage might be limited or denied for intentional acts, self-dealing, and misrepresentation in procurement of project approvals. Translation: if the board had done what we said it had done, the association might be left exposed. When that news started circulating, homeowner sentiment changed fast. June stopped by that Friday with fresh printouts from the neighborhood group. No one was talking about community spirit now. They were asking whether reserves were protected, whether special assessments were coming, whether board officers had indemnification, whether their dues had funded unauthorized site work. Money has a wonderful way of clarifying ethics. Then came Phyllis Hart. Every subdivision has one person who appears at exactly the moment a private grumble becomes organized action. In Calder Ridge, that person was Phyllis. Retired teacher, 2 lots over from the clubhouse, president of nothing officially, ruler of more things than anyone would admit. She called me that evening and introduced herself without wasted syllables. "I think the residents have been lied to," she said, "and I think we're ready to stop pretending otherwise." She asked no favors, she made no apologies for how long it took people to catch up. She simply wanted to know what parts of the record were public, what meeting procedures could force a vote, and whether Naomi would be willing to explain to a group of homeowners the difference between board authority and board misconduct. Naomi said yes. 3 nights later, 61 homeowners packed into a private meeting room at a church hall just outside the subdivision entrance. I didn't speak much, Naomi did most of it. She laid out the public filings, the scope of the case, the meaning of altered records, the potential insurer issues, the exposure to the association, and the significance of the quiet title action. No theatrics, no grandstanding, just sequence. When she finished, the room had the sound of people silently recalculating the last year of their lives. One man asked whether the pool would ever open. Naomi answered with professional restraint. Not lawfully, on that parcel, under these facts. A woman in the second row asked whether the board had known. Naomi didn't speculate. We have evidence certain officers were warned. That was enough. By the time the meeting ended, the hearing began at 9 on a Tuesday morning. County courtroom. Fluorescent lights. Wood benches polished by decades of people waiting to learn whether paper could change the shape of their lives. There's nothing cinematic about a room like that until the first real piece of evidence lands. Before then, it just feels administrative, a place for schedules, signatures, and people trying not to look nervous. By 8:40, the gallery was already fuller than anyone expected. Residents from Calder Ridge sat shoulder to shoulder in the back rows. Retirees, young parents, 2 men I recognized from the church hall meeting, and Phyllis Hart in a navy blouse with a legal pad on her lap, like she planned to grade everyone's performance. June was there too, upright as ever, eyes forward. Stevie Brandt sat 3 rows up with a notebook open, the kind of still attention reporters develop when they know the story may finally stop hinting and start naming. Marissa Dane sat at counsel table in a burgundy jacket, chin lifted, glasses on a chain, every inch the composed board president. If you glanced at her without context, you might have mistaken her for the wronged party. Some people know how to wear authority, even after it has begun to rot. Naomi arrived with 3 banker's boxes and no wasted motion. That was one of the reasons I trusted her. Other attorneys perform confidence. Naomi organized it. The judge, Doris Hale, took the bench exactly on time. She had the reputation of someone who did not enjoy being manipulated and did not hide that fact for the comfort of lawyers. The kind of judge who reads filings before hearings and has questions prepared before anyone rises to say, "Your Honor." The case was called. Naomi went first. She didn't posture, didn't thunder, didn't try to make a speech bigger than the room. She walked the court through the deed chain, the surveys, the parcel error, the emergency filings, the preserved evidence, the original PIN, the altered minutes, the surveyor's statement, the internal planning records, and the ownership chart that linked Marissa to the holding company waiting behind the pool project. Step by step. That matters. A lie often sounds stronger than the truth if the truth arrives scattered. Naomi knew that. So she built it the way you build load-bearing structure, each fact carrying the next. When Travis Boren testified, the room changed. He looked smaller than he had in Naomi's office, less like a professional witness and more like a man who had discovered too late that following instructions is not a legal defense when the instructions were corrupt to begin with. He confirmed the board had been warned about the boundary issue. He confirmed Marissa pushed for a layout that depended on the southeast corner. He confirmed the original line created design and access problems. He confirmed he knew the marker had been removed and failed to report it. Then Naomi showed him the text. Need the corner cleaned before recheck. Too many eyes on it now. Travis lowered his head before answering. Yes, he said. That is consistent with what I understood to be happening. Consistent. Even then, he was still trying, out of long habit, to soften the edges of what he had done. But the softness was gone from the room. People in the gallery were no longer learning a dispute existed. They were learning exactly how it had been carried out. Lydia Fenn testified next. Steady voice, no dramatics. She described the meeting where she objected. She identified the original version of the minutes containing her warning. She identified the later version with that warning removed. She explained why she resigned. Because the board was no longer managing a neighborhood, it was managing exposure. That line hit harder than any raised voice could have. The HOA's attorney did what he could. He argued reliance, ambiguity, good faith interpretation, procedural defects in how certain records had surfaced. He tried community benefit. He tried practical hardship. He tried the old lawyer's refuge of suggesting the facts were messy enough that the court should hesitate before imposing a clean remedy. But the facts weren't messy anymore. Not in the way that mattered. Judge Hale asked pointed questions about the parcel number, about the marker, about the dual versions of the minutes, about the holding company, about why a board president would have any private role in a post-completion asset structure connected to a project funded as a community amenity. Marissa did not testify. That was probably wise. It also told its own story. The ruling came just after noon. Judge Hale read from the bench in the measured tone judges use when they know every sentence may later be quoted by lawyers, insurers, reporters, and investigators. She found that I held clear title to the southeast parcel. She found the permit had been issued on an erroneous description and conferred no lawful right to build on my land. She found the HOA had no valid easement claim. She found the board action authorizing the construction rested on materially unreliable records and that the altered minutes further undermined the association's position. She ordered the HOA and all affiliated parties to cease operations on the parcel immediately. She confirmed that all improvements situated thereon belonged to the landowner. To me. Including the pool. The room did not erupt. Real relief rarely looks like movies. It sounds more like a long exhale from people who have spent months being lied to and have finally heard someone with authority say in public that the lie has ended. Naomi put one hand lightly on my arm. Across the aisle, Marissa removed her glasses and set them on the table. No visible collapse, no tears. Just the strange stillness of someone realizing poise, carefully maintained, has no value against a signed order. By 1:45 that afternoon, Cliff Murrow's pump truck was rolling down my access road. Bright yellow tank, diesel engine with a low, confident rumble that vibrated through the ground before it reached the ear. Cliff stepped out wearing work boots, a faded cap, and the expression of a man arriving for exactly the job he expected. "You got paper?" he asked. I handed him the order. He read the relevant page once, folded it, tucked it into his shirt pocket, and nodded towards the southeast line. "Then let's get to work." A few residents gathered at a distance near the temporary fence. Stevie was among them, so were June and Phyllis. Nobody interfered, nobody cheered, they just watched. Cliff and I removed the access covers together. Then he dropped the hoses. People have asked me since what it sounded like to empty that pool. The answer is mechanical. Deep at first, then steady. A throat-like gurgle at the drains turning into a sustained rush through reinforced hose, followed by the rhythmic industrial thrum of a machine doing exactly what it was built to do. It did not sound angry. It sounded inevitable. The water level dropped visibly within minutes. Chlorine gave way to wet concrete and mineral dust. The bright, inviting surface that had sold families on summer laughter sank lower and lower, until what remained was not an amenity, not a dream, not a symbol of community progress, just a concrete shell occupying the wrong ground. 4 loads, a little over 5 hours. By early evening the bottom was exposed, damp gray and streaked, with leaves plastered in corners and a shallow end shadow stretching long across the empty basin. The pergola lights hung dark above it. The whole thing looked less like a recreational facility than a set after the crew has gone home and the truth is visible again. The next morning, Cliff Murrow came back with anchors, tools, and a livestock waterer rated for commercial use. We bolted it into the shallow end, connected it to my well line, tested the float valve twice. Then I ran a single strand of low-voltage electric fence along the coping where it mattered most. Practical, cheap, effective. The kind of solution nobody in an HOA newsletter would call elegant, which is one reason I liked it. By noon, I opened the southeast gate and walked 6 Herefords towards the shell. Cattle do not care about scandal. They care about shade, footing, water pressure, and whether anything bites back. They crossed the threshold without ceremony, picked their way down the slope, and lowered their heads to drink from a trough installed where children's float toys had once been imagined. The echo